Awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new format of Marios History Talks today. We are joined by a great friend of Macedonia, a great friend of mine. You may know him as the Great Noldini. You might know him as Nolan, the Breaker of Horses, as he's known in some circles. But everybody else knows him as Nolan Gillies here. Really one of the best friends Macedonia has, and best part of it is he is not formally Macedonian, but since his activism for Macedonia, he has been more or less inducted and baptized into the Macedonian nation. So we'll think about the Macedonian name for his future epithets. But really, the goal tonight, we have this new novel concept of two guys talking with no script and no agenda. I know it's completely foreign to most audiences, but we're gonna try it. We'll see what happens. I think we read some history books. This is what people used to do back in the day. I think so. We're kind of trying to model some historical people how they used to talk. So we'll see where it takes us. The broad framework is really what the West gets wrong about Macedonia, which there's a lot. Probably not all we can fill in a couple hours tonight, but that's just the general North Star of what we'll talk about. We'll kind of let the conversation go from there. But before we get started, I'm sure everybody's on Twitter knew of the great Noldini. F in the chats for his suspension, of course. We're all hoping for a reprisal there. But Nolan, just tell it to audiences that don't know you, that aren't on Twitter for some reason. How did you get the Macedonia bug? Being I think you're Scottish, right? How did you get the Macedonia bug?
Yeah, I am so like my family came to the US from Scotland, but I don't feel like I'm Scottish in any like meaningful way. Like I'm just an American. But I got into Macedonia because like I was super interested in ancient history as a kid. And I fell in love with Oliver Stone's Alexander movie when I was like 12 years old, and that was my entry into like Macedonian history. And that's also like as I started researching Alexander on the internet and buying books, that's how I fell into like this Macedonia and Greece name dispute. And and that's where I kind of started realizing how much we actually get wrong about Macedonia in general. Because if you come at it from like the perspective of like ancient history, the Greeks, seem like they're correct all the time, but that framing allows them to kind of ignore 2,000 plus years of subsequent history. And so that's kind of where I was like, man, like this history is kind of messed up, and we're ignoring so much of it right now. And so that's how I got into like modern Macedonian history. And I visited for the first time in 2019, and Skopje was actually my first taste of Europe, like my first time out of the country. And so I went to Skopje and to Ohrid and Bitola, and then traveled to Aegean Macedonia, and I went to Solun and to Vergina, and then traveled all through Greece. And overall that whole trip took like 3 weeks, and it was just like it really reinvigorated like my love for history. I went back to school, finished my bachelor's, and here we are.
That's awesome. So if I get
So,
this correctly, you and I might have been backpacking, traveling at the same time because I was in Macedonia in 2019, going through former Yugoslavia. I was like in Slovenia,
okay.
Croatia, Bosnia.
When were you there? Because I was there in January.
Okay. So not January. I was there July actually, so during
Okay,
the
so
summer.
just a few months after, but
A
yeah.
few months off.
Yeah,
But
that would have been really funny if we had been there like at the same time.
oh yeah, dude, if I find Americans on like going through Macedonia, I'm gonna like convert them and proselytize on the
Oh yeah,
spot. Like
you
I'm
have
just
no other option.
you got to be our ambassador.
Yeah.
But what's funny is that's pretty much me how I got kind of with on board with Macedonia. It wasn't actually Oliver Stone's movie; it was 300. So then
Yeah.
from that led me to like, hey, well, wonder what the Macedonians were doing at this time, or a little bit later. So I watched Oliver Stone's movie, and I was like, okay, this is the coolest thing ever.
Yeah.
But yeah, that movie again is sparked the interest, but then you realize how much they got wrong, how much people get wrong. So it was kind of it was a catalyst, but it was a blessing and a curse almost because
Yeah.
it's not the most accurate. But we'll get into that really quickly though. On what's you want to give us a little tease? What's topic of your thesis, if you could even put that in a sentence. I know it must be a monstrosity of research, but what's the general
The
idea there?
overall the overall focus is the relationship of like Macedonian nationalism with Bulgarian nationalism, and like kind of where they come together, where they branch off, and I'm kind of like essentially the main argument and focus of my thesis is like, why did Macedonian nationalism survive when at different points in its history it could have been easily snuffed out
Mm,
by Bulgaria and by Serbia, by Greece. And ultimately, I'm using the framework of like ethnosymbolism, which is Anthony Smith's theory of nationalism, basically, that he's kind of piggybacking off of like the modernist and constructivist ideas of nationalism that like Gellner, Benedict Anderson, and those guys put forth. But he says that the only reason that nationalism works is because it taps into like an older ethnic identity, basically. And so
mm, okay.
the main argument is that the reason that Macedonians ultimately didn't become Serbs, didn't become Bulgarians, didn't become Greeks, is because there was an older ethnic identity that Macedonian nationalism taps into that the
That's
other national ideas just didn't capture the same way.
I think I actually have Smith's work here. It's actually a book translated in English, Macedonians: The Genesis of the Ethnic Name Through the Millennia by Dr. Branislav Svetozar Pokorny. And he
Mhm.
says like the identification of an ethnic group, and he also says a nation as well. But for ethnic group, he says self definition that includes a collective name, myths of common heritage and ancestry, common memories of former events, locations, and persons, one or more elements of a common culture, at least among the elites, some sense of unity is
Yeah,
what he kind of the broad framework of what defines ethnicity. So you kind of look at it, it might have been loose, it might have not have been fully formed, but there were definitely elements of that there going back, to the early modern era,
yeah,
really.
yeah, absolutely. And like, and even that older identity, it might not have had the name Macedonian attributed to it, but as a Macedonian national consciousness is forming, it is piggybacking off of like these local traditions and identities that already exist, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think that's one again. Just to start off the
And I think
conversation, one of the things
language
that
is probably the biggest part of like what kind of helps create that.
I think so too. Yeah, I mean, when we think about again using that's what Krista Bitkomisirkov said. They used the Bulgarian mask to kind of advance their agenda, but when you look at how fiercely they fought for language autonomy or even having their language represented, I mean, those are the inklings of Macedonianism. Those are the inklings of um, local rule, starting to kind of separate those interests, and that was happening in the 1840s, 1850s, with writing
Yeah,
in the
I was
local
gonna say that
dialects.
that
And
goes like early to mid 19th century is really when you
yeah,
start to see those like the unitarists and the separatists kind of split off.
oh
Um,
yeah, and I think that's the thing again, the West, because again, the Western conception of identity that they got wrong, it comes from like the West kind of political theory that a nation has to be attached to like a political state, like almost it's like a political theory, how a nation exists. Whereas like in the Eastern Europe, it's a different framework, it's a different idea of what a state and people is, because for a lot of our history, we don't have any of those attributes. Like we don't have any institutions of our own. We didn't have any church of our own. We didn't have any inklings of self rule. So to me, that's one of the biggest issues. Is they look at history, they see, oh, they labeled Bulgarian, oh, they're labeled Serbian. That's the problem there. Like, how do we reconcile that? Whereas they're now looking at it holistically, thinking, okay, they're using that label, but what are the interests they're advancing? Well, what is the agenda they're pushing? So,
yeah,
is that
I
kind of
also think yeah that's and I also think part of it too is like one of the big issues that like any nationalist theorist has is that there's kind of this ingrained tendency to look at nationalism as primordial, or that it's
mm,
something that's just kind of always there and that's the way it's always been. And so we project these national identities like clear into the past before they actually exist. And we don't look at
mm,
how maybe names and terms and things have changed over time. What
yeah?
it means to be a Bulgarian today is a lot different than what it would have meant, in the Middle Ages,
Well, you're
or even
telling
like
me that it's different in 681 AD versus today, buddy. I don't know that's gonna fly on Twitter, boy.
Yeah, no, it's
That's
not
like
going to fly in a lot of circles. But I mean, it's a fundamental flaw in the way that like we kind of view nationality and ethnicity in general, though, wouldn't you
as
say?
linear. I mean, everything in the West is linear. If you've noticed, I mean, it has to have
Right.
like a definitive starting place, ending place. It's always a linear conception, whereas a lot of cultures, especially looking at time, are circular, cyclical, and even like the
Yeah.
concept of history is not always linear in some cultures. So for them, it's like, oh, it started here, and here's the projection to the present day. Same with the Greeks.
Right, and
Like it started off in
it's
Athens.
not in reality, it's not always a continuous thing. So yeah, it's just a lot of that does stem just from the way we view nationality and ethnicity in general. Um, but also, I mean, we ignore so much history too. Like you can't possibly know everything, and
Yeah.
there's a lot that can't go into a 2 or 3 minute news segment, and so a lot just gets lost in the chaff, so to say.
Yeah. So, to what degree? I mean, this is a thing that I have conversations with another historian of mine. He's kind of the view that certain ethnic groups can be objectively defined as ethnic groups, even if they maybe are not aware of that necessarily. They may have again been under different banners, different ideas. I mean, he looks at the Torlaks, for example. He says that they're an ethnic group. Like there's no question about it. Even though they don't have their own state, they have all the attributes of an ethnic group. Again, it's not maybe a full separation from their country's identity necessarily. He kind of views them as a ethnic group. Montenegrins as well, even though again they're monarchies, their ruling class identified as Serbs. He said that they were still kind of their own ethnic group, just by historical factors. So one of the things I struggle with is, to what degree can ethnicity be defined as objective, saying, hey, you may think you are one thing, but objectively, like, let's slow down a bit. Like, that might not be actually an accurate classification if somebody, believes it. I mean, you see that with a lot of folks. I mean, you see folks, kind of taking on the sophisticated intellectual middle class identity, pretending saying they're Greeks, but we know by historical data they're not actually. They're Slavs. So to what degree do you view kind of ethnicity as objective versus something that's fluid or almost constructive during the time period?
Um, I mean, I err towards identity is just fluid. It just is. I would look to like Frederick Barr's ethnic groups and boundaries, and where he uses ethnicity as like he calls it categories of ascription and identification, and we basically use those to determine like social boundaries between different groups. That's generally how I view ethnicity, and that can change at different points in time. Um,
Mm.
but I don't know. Are you kind of getting at the idea that like when people say like Macedonians are ethnically Bulgarian, but they can have their own separate nation? Is that kind of what you're getting at there with that question?
Not so much that, just the kind of the can ethnicity be still an objective reality, saying, hey, even during this time period that the identity consciousness wasn't like fully crystallized, they were still their own ethnic group, even if again people maybe didn't have their concept of identity just yet, or even concept of nationalism, and their elites would have kind of flung to the elite identities of the era, whether they're Roman or Greek or whatever. Um, it's like my friend, for example, says in history you can still see that this enclave of people is an ethnic group, even if again maybe they didn't know it yet, or their people didn't weren't conceptualizing that idea just yet. He says you can kind of still look at the historical ideas, say, hey, they developed a certain way that kind of separated them from their neighbors. So it's an objective reality, even if again the people, the elites, may have differing views or differing ideas
I
of what
guess
even
it would
identity
really
is.
just depend on, do those people have a collective identity yet? I mean, are they, or is religion like their main basis of
Mm,
identity? Because that's, especially in the Ottoman Empire before, before nationalism had kind of started to proliferate in the Balkans, like religion was what told that was your main basis of identity. And so
yeah,
being a Greek at that time probably just meant you were part of the patriarchate in Constantinople,
exactly.
and being a Bulgarian probably just meant you were someone who went to the exarchate churches. So ethnicity in that regard probably wasn't as big of a deal until nationalism started to find its footing in the Balkans.
Yeah, that's what
So
Keith
I
Brownson
so
has
my
said.
yeah, and so I don't know, like I struggle to just be like, oh, there's an objective ethnic identity here when, those might not be categories that people are really using yet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. It's difficult, right? When again, you kind of look at the testimonies of people they identified some ways similarly, other ways differently, but still saying, you know what, at the end of the day, hey, you're still an ethnic group, you're still a people, even if again it wasn't like fully actualized just yet. It gets kind of hairy because are you projecting your modern conceptions of what identity and nationalism is, or are you kind of looking at it like a historian with a time and a place and a setting to explain
Yeah,
that? It gets a little bit hairy in modern discourse because again, Balkan people just see the word and okay, that's it, that's what they were, and I think that the West kind of
right.
falls into that trap as well. They see the
Yeah,
identity label and that's what they go after. And I think Keith Brown said that best. He said, all the Macedonians that were identifying as Bulgarian, like on before the 30s, for example, when it got way more of a political meaning, they just dropped it when they saw how it was being used to represent them and their people, especially abroad. They just stopped using it because they saw it no longer represented their interests anymore, or who they were. Whereas before it
yeah,
did, now again circumstance changed. It was more of a political meaning. So
yeah.
um,
Well, what I
again, that
wondered too is like when he says that, like who is he talking about? Like, is he talking about like kind of the more educated class of like Slavic people in Macedonia at that time? Because
hmm,
if you look at like Henry Brailsford and Edith Durham, who were traveling around Macedonia, and this is after the Ilinden Revolution, and they're
hmm,
saying that people have no clear sense of like what their ethnic or
yeah,
national identity is, and that the Bulgarian name is even forgotten.
hmm,
And all they have a concept of is being Christians.
yeah. That's what's interesting. I love Brailsford's. He said that exactly, but he said it again. They don't have the full identity as we understand it in the West, but they know they've placed their homeland on the map. They know what their homeland
Yeah,
is.
absolutely. And like
They have a
the landmarks
fatherland.
around them, like Samuel's fortress, like that means something to them, and it reminds them that they had a past before they were part of the Ottoman Empire. But
Exactly.
but like the names are Samuel, and like Bulgaria wouldn't have meant anything to those people at the time.
No, exactly. Yeah. So
So
kind of gives us an answer. He said again they don't have a full identity yet. He asked the kids. They didn't know who their forefathers were. The only thing they could say was they were Christians. But then Brailsford, he kind of develops that further. He says, yes, they don't have all these quote unquote identity markers that we have in the West, but again, they have a fatherland. They know what they're fighting for. They know what their end goal is. Like that's all the attributes of a nation without labeling it a nation essentially, because again, it just
yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
developed
for
essentially.
sure.
I think on just to piggyback on that, like so you could definitely comment on this. Just I think it was Rossos. He said what separated the Macedonian movement the most and really made it unique in that regard. It was the only movement in the Balkans that absolutely had no semblance of foreign or Western support or diplomacy or institutions or backing even from anybody. Like it was just
Yeah,
it was
I
in
mean,
a
it was an
chasm
idea
basically, and
that, yeah, I mean, the West didn't view Macedonia as like a separate national movement. Like they kind of conflated it with Bulgaria, but yeah, they had no
mhm,
institutional support. They didn't have a state. They had really not very many ways to proliferate propaganda. Like they had to use other states to publish their newspapers and their literature and whatnot at the time. And it like everything worked completely underground. So
oh yeah,
yeah, the fact that we're even talking about a Macedonian nation today kind of is a miracle because even the Bulgarians eventually they got their state, the Serbians got their state, the Greeks got their state, and they were able to spread their national consciousness a lot easier after that than the Macedonians had to do it without.
absolutely. I mean, I think that when you look at it, yeah, they were doing it without, but their struggle. I mean, again, if it was not successful, it would have been the complete obliteration of their people, of the memory of who they were, what they were. That's really what they were fighting against, and people don't quite understand that. It's just like, oh, why didn't you have your own newspapers in the Macedonian language? Why didn't you have a Macedonian army? Well, why didn't you make these things so abundantly clear? But again, they're missing the forest for the trees. That everything they were doing was completely illegitimate, completely illegal, without any inkling of support from the West around any of it.
Yeah.
Even as Christians supporting Christians, it was non-existent. So they actually had to use other movements, other countries to advance that. And like I said, it's a miracle because it wasn't just for autonomy; it was legitimately the entire people, whether they would survive or not, as people.
Yeah.
Which,
And that question of autonomy or independence is important too, right? And a lot of the original like Vombro leaders, they espoused, a separate consciousness from Bulgaria, but they also were like fighting for a state that was autonomous within the Ottoman Empire. And I think the reason for that, is I think even Duncan Perry mentions it's to protect Macedonia's territorial integrity. That
mhm,
partition was a big deal on their minds.
they already knew
Um,
that.
yeah. And so,
It,
even an autonomous Macedonia within the Ottoman Empire, like that's your first step to an independent state. And
mhm,
what's funny is like when you look at like the different proclamations of like the Christen Uprising in like the late 19th century, is you've got the one from the Macedonian Rebel Committee, which
mhm.
invokes the image of Alexander, and then you've got the one from the Bulgarian Committee that's invoking the image of like Tsar Samuel and whatnot. And
The
Hugh
Unity
Polton
Committee.
argues he's using the ones from the Rebel Committee, the Macedonian one. He says, well, that could also be the first step to integration with Bulgaria. But it's if you look at even just further in that document. So I've actually got it up here. So let me look for it real
Okay.
quick. I've
I remember. So on Wikipedia, this is really recent. I don't want to like point fingers on me, but I brought up the Christen Uprising. I brought up the Constitution, the preamble, and like 2 months later, on Wikipedia it says Bulgarians suspected to be a forgery of the '60s. The preamble to Kresna.
Yeah,
The
I mean,
Wikipedia page was
I don't
updated.
know. I don't have any reason to think that the documents compiled by like Hristo Antonov Plansky are forged. And
Yeah,
on the same note, I don't have any reason to believe that the documents that like the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences compiled are forged.
I don't think they're
I
forged,
have
but I think
I
I
have
was
no
gonna say I
way
do
to
think
say that.
Bulgaria does keep more documents in the archives than releases them. I'm not gonna say they're forged, but I think there's way more that
Yeah,
we don't know about.
yeah, but yeah, like that accusation that like the Christen Uprising from like the Macedonian side is like forged. Like I don't have any basis to like confirm or deny that claim. Like I can just take the document and and see it for what it is. But also I think the fact that like Georgi Pulevsky was fighting in that uprising, and he was someone who espoused the idea of like the Macedonians as like proto Slavs, like they're the original Slavs.
Hmm.
That to me, like where would that proclamation have got that idea from? Probably from Pulevsky. And
It's
so to
exactly
me,
what I
like
said.
that links them, and so I at least have that basis. But like I said, Polton's saying like according to I think it was Rule 145.
Hmm. Jamie, can we get that pulled up?
After the
The Christen
liberation of
Uprising.
Yeah, so he says after the liberation of our fatherland, the Central Committee will prepare a constitution for the organization of the state of Macedonia as either autonomous or with political and cultural autonomy within the Ottoman Empire or outside it, should the European great powers allow this. And he argues like that could also be the first step to integration with Bulgaria. But even
Hmm.
just looking further into those rules, like 182, he says they say that the uprising is internal, can't succeed if it fails to convince Europe of our struggle for liberation.
Hmm.
Um, also 186 is particularly important because it says the Macedonian Rebel Committee will also inform the government of the Principality of Bulgaria that Macedonians will have no dealings with the Principality other than those of fraternal aid from our Slav brothers. And then in 191, they basically say the same thing. They're going to secure help from Bulgaria, but also from Serbia, and they refer to both as their fraternal brothers. And
Yep.
so I'm like that
That
that talk of brotherhood to me kind of um, it smacks of Pan-Slavism. And
Oh
so
yeah,
it's kind of like the early manifestations of this idea of like a pan-Slavic Balkan federation. I don't
yeah,
think it implies unification with Bulgaria. I don't think it implies unification with Serbia in a national
mm,
sense. I think they're
yeah,
that's kind of the early manifestations of that idea for like a pan-Balkan federation.
yeah. I think that's what Delchev. I mean, he called it exactly when he was talking to the supremacist general Nikolaev in
Yeah.
Sofia. He said, we're asking for brotherly, fraternal help. We're not asking for overlords. So
Yeah,
again,
we
he's
don't
looking
seek
at help from.
masters.
We don't see
And he
masters
also makes
exactly.
that important statement of like, we the people, you know who I mean by we, like the Macedonian
Yeah,
people, the peasants.
Macedonian people, the peasants. Yeah, yeah. So again, when you look at it, yeah, the
There's
inklings
not as
are
much
there.
room for like ambiguity as like sometimes historians want to attribute to some of these documents.
Yeah,
Like to me that Christen Uprising, like that clearly shows they're striving for independence ultimately.
yeah. And what's weird is it gets buried way more. You think it'd be so much more prevalent in discourse, which
Yeah,
Preston
I was gonna
Uprising.
bring that up too. Like, why is nobody writing about this uprising that happened and
I
like
know.
clearly shows two separate national ideas pitting against each other here? Like
Oh
the
yeah.
only
Oh yeah.
mention I've seen of it was in R.J. Crampton's like survey of Bulgaria. It's like a
Mhm.
survey history, and then Hugh Poulton's book on the Macedonians. And like in Hugh
It's,
Poulton's book, it gets maybe a paragraph, and in
yeah.
R.J. Crampton's book, it's a sentence.
It doesn't get as nearly as much. And that's what's interesting to me. Kind of the I'll say Bulgarian tendency to hyphenate all the uprisings. So historically, the
Yeah,
Crescent
so
Uprising.
like
I mean,
Illinden
it,
Preobrazhensky, or I think
yep,
that's the
yep,
word, and then
yep,
Kresna Razlog.
yep.
And for them, it's it's always tying these Macedonian events into a wider Bulgarian umbrella.
Of course. Of course. And with the Crescent Uprising, again, people forget. I mean, I call it Crescent Uprising too because people know what it means, but the stamp, the letters all says the Macedonian Uprising, Makedonsko
Mhm.
Vostania. That's how Dimitar Popgeorgiev Berovsky signed his letters, his stamps, all said the Macedonian Uprising. And again, when we think about it, the fact that just it doesn't get nearly the amount of attention it should, it's interesting to me because arguably it was more of a nativist movement. It was one of the first clashes between Macedonian and Bulgarian interests. And like Dimitar Popgeorgiev Berovsky, dude was a badass. I mean, I did a whole video on him. Like, I was just so amazed by his life. Like, just he sold all his real estate, all his assets to fund the movement. He actually had real world experience and war strategy, like war experience as well, strategy and whatnot. I mean, it was successful until it ceased to become Macedonian anymore, until they got the unity movement involved. So
Yeah,
I don't know why it's not always people point to Ilinden, 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 which yeah, it's the mythos of it, but like arguably there's way more behind it to really do more research around. Have you
yeah.
done? Is anything part of your thesis, the Crescent Uprising?
Basically, just what we had just kind of mentioned is about as much as what's going into it. Because yeah, there's not a whole lot of historiography on it, and like I don't have the ability to go to Macedonia or to Bulgaria
Hmm.
right now to really like dig into the archives, and I need to learn
Yeah,
the language.
yeah, that'd
So
be cool.
I mean,
I do have a
I
book
have
here.
like a novice. I have a novice understanding of both languages, and that's it. Like I
Oh,
can ask
dude.
for directions. I can read Cyrillic, and I
Yeah,
can like greet people, and that's about it. So
I will say, out of again, not a Slavic philologist, but of all the Slavic languages, I think you got the best pick with Macedonian being the easiest. I really
oh,
do. Like
absolutely, I agree.
no
Like
cases.
everything's phonetically like spelled, like it's spelled exactly how it sounds, and like like Victor Friedman even says like Macedonian orthography fits the language perfectly because it was specifically designed that way. It wasn't made to like get closer to another language like Bulgarian, for instance. They adopted aspects of Russian orthography into their
True.
language, and so
And
yeah,
pronunciation. I actually
yeah.
talked to him. I said, I'm being very upfront. Like, I don't get Macedonians like, oh, Macedonian and Bulgaria are not, they're not close, and Macedonian's closer to Serbian, whatever. I told him I can read Bulgarian just fine. it's very simple to read. You just got to get past certain letters that we don't have. But reading Bulgarian, very easy. I cannot understand that on the news though. I cannot understand spoken Bulgarian on the news as a, official prestige literary Bulgarian. I'm being open about that. Something I'm saying to artificially divide the two. And I said the exact opposite with Serbian. I said Serbian, I have a harder time reading because of the cases, but when I hear it spoken, it's much easier to digest. That you kind of pick up the phrases and the words. And he said
Yeah.
that's exactly Macedonian, because Macedonian does not have cases like Bulgarian, but the pronunciation is closer to Serbian because, like the other South Slavs, they don't have vowel reduction, which Bulgarian does have. And that's an element, I think, of actually Ukrainian style pronunciation, having some semblance of vowel reductions in their language, which to the Macedonian sounds a little bit more not as enunciated, basically.
Yeah. So
So I
I
thought it
have
was
a funny
interesting.
anecdote about Serbian and Bulgarian, but there's a dude on Twitter from Serbia, and I think I was arguing with somebody about how they're making the claim that Macedonian was artificially Serbianized or whatever, and the Serbian guy goes, well, if that was true, we'd be able to understand those hobbits down there.
Love, love. We're hobbits and we're monkeys. I'm
Yeah.
kind of like on the primal aspect. Oh, that's
Yeah.
perfect. It's true. And Macedonians go out of their way to like always speak Serbian with Serbians. I get that, part of Yugoslavia, but it's not a two-way street. I don't understand why it's not reciprocated. And I think it is actually kind of I think Macedonian is similar to Slovenian in the fact that it's on the fringe, and again, it just so deviated from Serbo-Croatian that they just don't even try. Because Slovenian is actually similar to Macedonia in the fact that they were both kind of I don't say the outliers, but definitely on the fringes of some
Yeah.
respect. And similar to us, they also kind of have some territorial issues with their neighboring countries kind of being divided. So they're actually interesting parallelism there.
Huh. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about Slovenia, so I can't speak to that, but that is
Yeah.
interesting to know.
Yeah, and they're similar. But anyway, really quickly, just on the your research, there's a really good book here. I'm trying to find a copy and send it to you. Or I can scan it. I don't know if you have it, The Creation of the Modern Macedonian State.
I don't have that
It's in
book,
English.
no.
It's really good. It's a kind of like an anthology. It's Vlatko Popovsky, Vancho Georgiev, Zoran Todorovsky, and Violeta Achkoska. It's all in English. It starts at the like
Are they
pre
scholars at like UKIM or anything?
um double check. Believe so. They're all PhDs. So I would assume. But I'm gonna try to get this book sent out to you one way or another. If not, if I don't get a copy, I'll scan it to you for your research, or you can just send it back. But it's actually really good, man. It's actually well cited as well. That's where I found a little bit more documents around the Christen Uprising here. And there's a document I've seen here. I can post it up later. There's actually like a proclamation handwritten um, from the Liberation Committee. It says a call made by the Macedonian Insurgent Committee of May 2nd, 1879, in which the Macedonians are called to arms for the liberation of Macedonia. And it says Makedonci at the very top, but then in the text it says Junaci Makedonski I Bulgarski.
Huh.
And I've never seen this, but I'm gonna send it to you. It might be good for your research
Yeah,
from
no,
the
that sounds awesome. I appreciate that.
archives. Yeah. So.
While we're on that topic of the Crescent Uprising, though, there's actually
Mhm.
in that same like archival collection that like Polyansky put together, there's a letter from Georgi Plevsky to Despot Bajovic. It was
Mhm.
I think he was like a Serbian voivoda or something. But anyway,
Mhm.
he goes, you wanted to volunteer and you promised 1,000 to 2,000 volunteers. This is good and even admirable, but I advise you not to come here with your people since something bad is happening here. The Bulgarians here are playing tricks with us and are turning the water to their mill alongside divine Nathaniel, who is a Macedonian, but rather inclined towards the Bulgarians. If you really have 1 to 2,000 volunteers, ask the Serbian government for help. I believe they are more humane. So it shows even Palevsky's seeing this tension between between the Macedonian rebels and the Bulgarian government at the time.
Mhm.
Um, and the bishop Nathaniel he's talking about, he's an exorcist,
Yeah.
and who's also partaking in the uprising, but he's working in the interests of Bulgaria at this time.
Yeah.
But I also
Yeah.
just on a kind of like random aside, it was like 1 to 2,000 guerrilla fighters. Like that's huge, right? Like
Oh yeah.
most of the time, the guerrilla bands that are fighting like in Illingen are like 5 or 6 people, or there's maybe
Hmm.
like a couple hundred. Like having a 1 to 2,000 volunteers for the cause, like that's a huge contribution.
Oh yeah.
And
No,
almost
that's
seems uncharacteristic of those uprisings.
yeah. I think Bishop Nathaniel. I think he a lot of the blame is kind of pointed to him in modern historiography, just in terms of wanting more unity with the Bulgarian Identity Committee, the Unity Committee. He
Yeah,
definitely had more of a pro-Bulgarian orientation to his views, but no, that's an interesting letter that Pulivsky, which is characteristic of Pulivsky. He definitely was very suspicious of the Bulgarian influence in Macedonia. That's a where'd you come across that?
it's like an archival collection that the Macedonian government had put together like in the 80s. It's called
Oh, very cool.
Documents on the Struggle of the Macedonian People for Independence
Oh
and a
yeah,
Nation State. Like if you can find
that
those somewhere, it is a gold mine
I
of
need to find that
documents.
book.
And like there's kind of like a rival one that was published in the 60s, so a little bit before, but the Bulgarian Academy of Science
Yep,
published it, and
I
it's
have seen that one.
documents and
My buddy has it.
materials. Yeah, so I mean like it's really good because like you can get a lot of primary source information out of them, especially if you
Oh yeah.
don't have access to the archives in Sofia or in Skopje.
Here's
So
something I just thought of that again people get wrong about the narrative, especially around Yugoslavia. The idea that in the Yugoslav period, just the word Bulgarian was completely was completely removed from the record, from the archives. Like any reference to it was just blotted out. And I'm looking through
yeah,
like the documents from the era from like the 70s and 80s even, and like it's there. Like they're very open that
yeah,
this is the label that was used. And I saw people talk about the Miladinov brothers, the title of the book. They cropped it out to not show Bulgarian. I looked through the book. The poems are the exact original ones. They have the words Bulgarka there, for example. And then I
yeah,
look at I have the book The History of the Macedonian People, also from Yugoslavia. Again, a compilation of different authors in English, and it says there that the first name of VMRO could have been the Bulgarian Macedonian Adrianople Revolutionary Committee, and they said, but you see this because again the conditions in Macedonia did not exist for a movement of their own; they had to latch themselves onto somebody else. And I thought that
yeah,
was just kind of remarkable that they were very open about the elephant in the room, but they didn't see it as a problem in establishing the narrative and the context. And now the idea is, oh, they just removed all that just to make people anti-Bulgarian. Have you come across that?
yeah. I've heard that claim. I will say, like in the documents I just showed you, like it's kind of the same. Like they've got stuff from a Bulgarian perspective in there. They've got Serbian documents in there, and I mean, like they're pretty open. I'd even risk it and say they're honest. About
Hmm.
Macedonia's position, especially like early on. Before the Macedonian state existed, and it was kind of in a state of limbo, right? Um, so yeah, like I said, they never when people say that, like, oh, they're forging documents, they're replacing the word Macedonian or Bulgarian with Macedonian. It was like you never bring forth a name. Tell me who's doing this so I can look
Yeah.
at it myself. You know,
Oh yeah.
you can't just like when you're going to make that claim, the burden of proof is on you to show me, who is
Hmm.
doing this. And like
Uh,
I haven't seen it among like at least Macedonian scholars, people with actual credentials.
hmm.
So, and I mean,
Uh,
I don't doubt that these like archival collections are put together with an agenda. I mean, that's true of Macedonians, that's true of Bulgarians. But that doesn't mean the documents are bad. It
oh yeah.
just means that they're being selective about which ones they're compiling to show like, hey, this is where our idea of our nationhood comes from, and for the Bulgarians, this is where the idea of Macedonian Bulgarianism comes from.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting note. Those are both like essentially just like disses at each other. One was compiled at the reaction of the other being compiled, which kind of cool
Yeah,
that states do that. But that's just interesting. And again, this is me as a Macedonian with a Macedonian bias. I at least think that Macedonian historians leave the space to more ambiguity and leave a reasonable basis of doubt that yes, maybe all of our ancestors didn't have a Macedonian consciousness or a Macedonian agenda. Looking at the case in Bulgaria, it's like everybody was aligned to Bulgaria, Bulgarian, independence, Bulgarian unification. I don't see as much ambiguity there that like as a historian or researching, I would like to. Like for example, I've seen interviews with Macedonians saying, yeah, Todor Alexandrov, he didn't really identify with a Macedonian consciousness. Like they kind of just said that openly. I think it was um, Blažeristovsky. He kind of was pretty open about it instead of like trying to reconciling him, saying, yeah, he pretty much was more pro-Bulgarian oriented. I don't really see that on the Bulgarian side. I think they even like even if somebody's controversial as Yanis Sandansky, they still try to reconcile him as still kind of in some way fighting for the Bulgarian ideal, even though he was controversial. I don't know. That just might
Yeah.
be my own bias there, but I think for them, it's like this is a Bulgarian national identity going back to the 10th century. That's the narrative. We're sticking to it. I don't know. That's just kind of what I've noticed.
Yeah,
What are your
no,
thoughts on that?
I agree with you, and and that's something we see like with our Twitter friends. It's like they don't want to acknowledge like that there is maybe some fluid concept of identity here, or that like they don't want to acknowledge the ambiguity. And certainly like the Bulgarian state right now is not interested in acknowledging any sense of like conflict with Bulgarian identity, at any point when it comes to Macedonia. So I don't know.
It was all hunky
You
dory
know,
until
it's
Tito got along. Pretty much is what we hear. It
yeah.
was all Bulgarian, then Tito.
One thing too is like sometimes like the year that some of these like collections are published can tell you a lot about like the agenda behind them. Like this one, Documents and Materials on the History of the Bulgarian People. That's
Mm,
the publication year I think is 1969, and
mm,
so that coincides with Todor Zhivkov's
mm,
dictatorship. And Moscow at the time was kind of loosening some of the pressure on them because they wanted to, poke a thumb in Yugoslavia's eye. And so Zhivkov decided that, we need to have education that promotes national pride in Bulgaria. And so they kind of opened the Macedonian issue up again, even though it had been kind
mm,
of on ice after the Macedonianization program in Pieter, Macedonia had been canceled.
mm.
So they reopened that program, and that's where you kind of see the polemics begin again,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
And
and
Bulgaria
then
has a
yeah,
really weird relationship to communism when you think about it. Right nowadays their whole rhetoric is anti-communism. Macedonia is a communist creation. We're freedom-loving Europeans, but there's so much of their narrative and ideas on the modern Macedonian question is just it's just the Zhivkov regime and the Zhivkov dictatorship.
yeah, yeah,
What
absolutely.
that's
And
so much of it comes from that time period.
right. Well, and you can just, by looking at like internal issues within Bulgaria, like you can almost kind of tell like when they're going to reopen up this Macedonian issue again. It's like, do they need to distract people from, some sort of corruption scandal or like is something up with the economy right now? Like then
Hmm.
that's when you see the rhetoric really, really inflamed. And even right
Hmm.
now, all the scholars on the commission between Macedonia and Bulgaria, like they are not interested in compromise. Like it's just a
No,
matter of like forcing Bulgarian demands, um, because Macedonia is not really in a position to negotiate right now.
no. And that's the thing I think about. I mean, I don't know what a compromise would look like. I think I read like in one scenario, I think it was Serbia and Croatia, I want to say, or where they just kind of officially acknowledged like some kind of compromise between each other, saying like, hey, we as governments will agree to this kind of basis, but we're still going to teach our students what we want to teach our students, respectively. Like we'll legally come to terms, but the textbooks are still going to say, Croatia's rightful Serbian land and Serbia's rightful Croatian land. So I don't know. That was kind of like the most like not reasonable, but closest I've come to like a scenario where they have come to a compromise. How do you see Macedonia and Bulgaria even like trying to compromise when it's as complicated and hairy as it is in the national history between the two countries?
I don't know. It's complicated, right? Like for one thing, like we do have to acknowledge, like, is there Bulgarian influence in Macedonia? Yes, and a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that, but at the same time, Bulgaria has to acknowledge that there is a Macedonian nation. It has to acknowledge there is a Macedonian language, and it has to
Mhm.
acknowledge the conflict runs deeper than Tito's lifetime.
Mhm.
And especially like looking at World War II. Um, Tito recognizes the Macedonian nation at the Second Congress of Bihać, and that effectively turns the tide of the war in Macedonia in the partisans' favor. Like they overwhelmingly decide to start, flocking to the partisans at that point, not to the Milovists, who are,
Mhm.
they might espouse like an independent Macedonian agenda, but they still ultimately view themselves as ethnically Bulgarians. So the fact that Macedonians joined the partisans at that point in time should tell you something about Macedonian identity. Any
Mhm.
like espousal of Bulgarian identity at that time probably was really thin or not, strongly felt by people at the
Mhm.
time. And like
I,
that resonance of identity is ultimately what matters, right?
Absolutely.
There's a quote from Ernest Renan. I'm going to pull it up real quick.
Please.
He says the existence of a nation is a plebiscite of every day, as the existence of the individual is a perpetual affirmation of life. So essentially,
I like that.
your national identity, your ethnic identity, it's something you choose every day. It's
Mhm.
something you reinforce every day and you participate in. And ultimately,
So me identifying
Macedonians,
as a hobbit
yeah,
is
I
something
mean,
I carry every day.
Yeah, Macedonians ultimately, like, Bulgarian identity did not resonate with them, and Bulgaria has to reconcile with that. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that there aren't Macedonians with a Bulgarian identity, and that's just as valid of an expression of identity as
Sure.
Macedonian nationality
Yeah.
is. But there is still a Macedonian nation, and as long as
Yeah.
people believe that and speak the Macedonian language and affirm that every day, then that's always going to be true. And that's
For
ultimately
sure.
what matters. Like, we can throw facts and statistics and arguments at each other all day, but ultimately, at the end of the day, people identify as Macedonian.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it did not start in the 40s, obviously. I mean, this is a long-running issue. But one of the things I tweeted, I remember, I was kind of thinking about this. I said something along the lines of, when you said, yeah, the Bulgarian identity didn't really resonate with him, I said it was one thing to kind of be under the Bulgarian millet, still fight for Macedonia, call yourself a Macedonian Bulgarian, fight for autonomy, fight for independence, fight for your rights. And another thing to still call yourself that, but see a Bulgarian administration, Bulgarian bureaucrats, Bulgarian law come to your doorstep. Fastest cure for Bulgarophilia there is, when you kind of see it
Right.
at your doorstep, versus like, yeah, we call ourselves that, but we're kind of doing our own thing. Like, don't get involved. Give us money, but we're still do our own thing. It was, again, like you said, it didn't resonate as much when push came to shove, and you're living the reality of being not your own autonomous home rule region, being directly annexed and incorporated into the Bulgarian state. Completely different situation. I think that was kind of like the
Yeah.
wake up call for people. Like, yeah, we had it pretty good when it was under the Ottomans, but now that it's different, it doesn't hit home the same way.
Yeah. Well, now that was actually, I think that's probably like the occupation of Bulgaria in Vardar, Macedonia, in both World War One and World War Two. Were
Hmm.
well, and Aegean Macedonia, I should say, for World War II. But one of the big things that ultimately I think even drove Macedonians away from Bulgarophilism was the fact that like Bulgarians kind of took it for granted that like, oh, Macedonians are our people. So they don't grant them any local autonomy. They don't let Macedonians govern the little districts of Macedonia. They send in Bulgarians.
Oh yeah.
And then being forced into like the general mobilization and not fighting in Macedonia but fighting in other places, like that's,
Mhm.
I mean, those are all factors that contributed to the growing presence of Macedonian nationalism over
Oh, yeah.
Bulgarian.
I was
So
reading Elena Sekuluskov's thesis on this, on Bulgarian administration, World War II administration, but
yeah.
I almost kind of got a sense of, I mean, there was like from, bona fide Bulgarians, almost like a resentment towards the Macedonians, like, hey, we fought all these wars for you, and yet we still feel like you're gonna slip from our fingers, like you're not grateful for it, you're not, proud Bulgarians. I kind of almost got a sense, like, I don't want to say punishment, but definitely a paternalistic attitude to no end. Like, you can't figure
Well,
this out
I mean,
yourself.
Serbs have
You're
that attitude
ungrateful.
too, right? Like they are, well, we selflessly liberated you. Why don't you want to be us? And I mean, that was definitely the attitude of the Serbian government in Vardar, Macedonia, like in the interwar period too.
Hmm.
And like on top of that, like like Macedonian students, like that we mentioned earlier, they would kind of lash out in classes and be like, "Sorry, we don't understand Serbian. Can you speak Macedonian?" And
Hmm.
but if you read there's an article from the 50s by Horace Lunt, who was the first guy
Hmm.
to put the Macedonian grammar like into English, and
Hmm. Yep.
his one of his like hypotheses in this article called, just I think it's called, the creation of standard Macedonian, some facts and attitudes. But the Macedonian language contributed to like this paternalistic attitude that Serbs had towards Macedonians, because they viewed the Macedonian language as like kind of an irritating form of pidgin. Like it's gibberish. Like how, like, why is a grown person speaking so stupidly? And so it contributed to this view that like Macedonians are less intelligent than Serbs, and so they
Yep.
just need to be better educated, and then they can become good Serbs. And so I think that attitude is reflected in Bulgarians too. And like if you
I
look
do
at
too.
Bulgarian media, like there's that video that gets passed around a lot of the Bulgarian journalists asking this older Macedonian guy in Skopje, like, "Oh, why is there a statue of Alexander
Yep.
here? Who's that?" And he's like,
L-
"Yeah, Macedonis." And he's like,
Love
"What
that guy.
about
He's
Tsar
like, oh,
Samuel?
bullshit.
Macedonis, bullshit, bullshit."
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Bullshit. Bullheaded.
but I mean, like their whole thing is like they poke fun at Macedonians. They kind of treat you guys like zoo animals. Like you're just,
Yeah.
it's like the Florida of the Balkans in their mind. So, and that, I think, yeah, that attitude's definitely reflected in Bulgaria as well.
Hmm.
But I mean,
Yep.
it was also very prevalent in Serbia. So, and I think just
And I think
that, just being looked down on as like, people don't want to identify with people that shit on them.
for sure. And that to me is a kind of tragedy. I think you just kind of gave me two crystallized ideas what you just said there. It was never going to work. That's like kind of union with Bulgaria or like a Macedono-Bulgarian, uh, you know, identity or cooperation. When you think about it, I mean, Bulgaria views Macedonia as like their Kosovo, right? I mean, they view it as like the heartland of the Bulgarian Empire, the Bulgarian literary cultural achievements, especially out of Ohrid. At the same time, they're like, yeah, these guys they speak this bastardized Slavic language with all of a bunch of Albanianisms and Greekisms in there. It's not even fit to speak with. So it's just like in their minds they held up this really romanticized view of Macedonia as being the heartland of their empire, but the reality of the situation was that they saw them as the backwater essentially
Yeah, I
of
mean,
what
it's
they
like
consider Bulgarian
their
land.
stated view of Macedonia really contradicts what they actually view, like how they actually view it, and the people
Oh yeah,
especially. Um,
yeah, and that's what Georgi Pulivsky, or sorry, Grigor Prilichev. To me, that's why he's so tragic because he tried so hard to be accepted. When the Greeks turned him down, he tried so hard to be accepted by the Bulgarians, and they said his whole language, his whole dialect was, stinking of Arnautisms, which Albanianisms and Hellenisms. It was a vulgar, it was peasant speech, so they considered it. So again, to me, it's just like, yes, they consider Macedonia the sacred, holy part of their history and heritage, but at the same time, I mean, god dang, they viewed Macedonians as children, not knowing how to speak proper Bulgarian and not even knowing what their interests were. I mean, you think about the Unity Committee, the supremacists. Hey, you can't even do this yourself. Like, let us do it for you. So, my God, I mean, when you think, I don't want to be like deterministic in that sense, but from the very beginning, there were clearly cleavages starting to form between
yeah,
A Macedonian agenda and a Bulgarian agenda.
yeah, and I wouldn't even say that's deterministic. I mean, that's just the documents reflect that, right? Like,
Yeah.
and the historiography reflects that, and even that letter we were talking about, or that conversation we were talking about earlier between Gotze Delchev and Daniel Nikolaev.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest things he says is like we're not looking to you as masters, but even like Nikolaev says, the peasants aren't capable of doing anything. Like the Bulgarian
Yeah.
army has to be here, and we'll
Yeah.
we'll tell you when to rise up. And
Yeah.
Delchev's like, no, like to hell with you. Like we'll decide because it's our lives on the line here. It's life or death for us. Like there's no
Yeah.
other option. If
Yeah.
it fails, you're gonna be fine. you know,
Yeah.
but
I mean, he says life or death. I mean, we talked about this. I mean, life or death meant like if this didn't succeed, the very name Macedonia and Macedonian people would just be swallowed in a vacuum. It just would cease to exist. I mean, you think about they're
yeah,
fighting for autonomy, sure, but had they failed, they would have just been absorbed into a chasm, and that's it. Like you're Serbians, you're Bulgarians now. I mean, it's
yeah.
game over. So life or death, literally. But yeah,
And in a
to
way,
me,
you could
I don't
even
say.
argue it kind of did die for a while after the partition of the region. Like
Mm,
the Macedonians really couldn't organize for quite a while. Um,
it's
so
true.
the fact that that identity even persisted even into like World War One, like it's kind of astonishing that we're even talking about a Macedonian nation today.
Yeah. I mean, true, and I think people kind of lose sight of that fact. Now, it's kind of interesting thing we bring up, kind of like the survival of this identity, against all odds, and again, without any support or backing from the West. And I don't be political. I'm trying, but people talk about Israel, the miracle of the Israeli state, the Israeli identity. I'm like, yeah, true, did a lot there, but also has the complete total support of the West. Meanwhile, our
Yeah,
little neck of the woods here, literally did it completely on our own, and we still managed to pull it off somehow, and survive as an identity. And I just hate the double standard of oh, one's a natural identity, one's a artificial created identity,
right. And it's like
and
what identity truly is just natural, right? Like to some extent, all of our identities are constructed. Some might be older than others. But, that doesn't mean anything. Like so what
yeah,
if your identity's 6,000 years old? Like I'm sure it's made changes over time. I mean, look at how many times Greek identity has changed.
I mean,
They called
yeah,
themselves Romeo, like
yeah,
until the formation of the Greek state. And
oh
even
yeah,
like as they're surveying Greek islands, they're saying, the Greeks would say like, "Oh, we're Greeks like you," and then the people on the island would say, "No, we're
the hell
Romans
you
like
are,
you are," you know.
yep, and
So I mean, that's an important thing too. Is like not even just Macedonian identity has undergone, this period of construction and change. Like Greek identity
yeah,
has, Bulgarian identity has.
yeah,
And the funny thing is, like, everyone always says that, Macedonia is a Yugoslav creation. And sure, we can say, yeah, the state was created by Yugoslavia, but, we could say the same about Greece and Bulgaria. Without Britain, France, and Russia, Greece doesn't
yeah,
exist. There would be no Greek
oh yeah, of
nation. They would have been snuffed out by the
course,
Ottomans too.
oh yeah,
If without Russia, there is no Bulgaria. So, I mean, we can point to a lot of states and say that they have an outside creator. That doesn't make them illegitimate.
mm,
Um,
yeah.
so
I think what's interesting with Macedonia, at least, kind of again, I don't want to give the Macedonian bias here, like we're special, but we at least our identity wasn't created by stamping out other identities or imposing a language on other people. Like we look at
right,
Greece. I mean, first of all, not a whole lot of people spoke Greek outside of the church. They spoke their local Albanian, Vlach, Turkish languages. There was still Greek being spoken, but not widely spoken. A lot of people had to be assimilated into the Greek nation, especially the refugees. And in
right,
Bulgaria, I mean, you look at what they've done to the Turkish minority there, trying to Bulgarize them essentially. So I'm at least happy that the Macedonian identity was able to survive, but not at the expense of another
of
people,
other
another
identities. Yeah.
identity. We
Well,
didn't
and
have to do that to
I
the
mean,
Vlachs. They're still
even
there.
yeah, even among Greeks, like Greek is a second language to a lot of people within Greece. Like, and one of the people that wrote my letters of recommendation to get into grad school, she told me a story, and while she was in grad school, they were in the Peloponnese, and they were at like some village, and once the sun went down, everyone started speaking Albanian. And like when
Oh
they
wow.
expressed surprise over that, they were said, well, we're 100% Greeks, but our grandfathers were forced to speak Turkish, at gunpoint, but then, or not Turkish, Albanian at gunpoint,
Hmm.
by the Turks. And then it was just kind of understood that like when the sun comes up again, everyone speaks Greek.
Okay.
So, and I mean, and I'm sure that's probably a similar case among like Macedonians in Greece today too. Like they still
Oh
speak
yeah.
Macedonian, but but they also speak Greek, and they're
I was
essentially,
surprised.
yeah, I mean, by legally they're Greek nationals. They're probably loyal to the Greek state. They participate in the conscription order that everyone has to go through in the Greek state. But
Hmm.
they have a different ethnic consciousness,
Yep.
even if it's not outwardly expressed all the time. So
Oh yeah. When I was there with Philip traveling, I kind of discovered that asking them, "Hey, do you speak Macedonian?" Probably gonna get some confused looks. But if I said, "Hey, do you speak Dopia or Dopika?"
yeah,
The indigenous
then
dialects. Oh my God, do they light up? Do they
yeah,
light up? There's, oh, my grandparents spoke it to me, my dad speaks it to me, but it's just like for some, they don't make the bridge that hey, this is kind of like the language they speak across the border. They still kind of think it's two separate things. It's a Greek thing almost for a lot of folks. But
yeah,
when you phrase it like that, dude, I was talking Dopika, native to waitresses, like 16, 17-year olds at cafe shops. They're like, yeah, we know that. But when you kind of say Macedonian, kind of their Greek side kind
they're like,
of jumps over and spooks
yeah,
them a bit. But you say Dopia, it's simple as that. So, yeah, that's again what I'm kind of happy to be proud to be Macedonian is again, we didn't have to resort to that. Like I'm happy that the Roma are still the Roma. I'm happy the Vlachs are still the Vlachs. The Jews are still the Jews. The Turks are still the Turks. Albanians are still Albanians. I'm happy
yeah.
about that. I'm happy there was no pressure for them to give that up because we look at Vilchev's ideal. He
I mean,
Macedonia was
that
big
was
enough for
what
everybody.
Moldova fought for, right? Like they were
Yeah,
very influenced by like socialist and anarchist ideas, but I mean, Macedonia was supposed to be a home for everybody that was native to the region,
exactly.
regardless of what their national or ethnic identity was.
Exactly. And as I said, I did an interview with MPO, which again, there's bad blood there. Don't get me wrong, but I talked to one of their committee, their central committee members. His name is Nick. He's an older
Yeah,
gentleman.
I think
I
I
mean,
watched that video. Is that Nick
yeah,
Stefanov? Yeah,
yep, Nick Stefanov. Yeah, he identifies as Macedonian Bulgarian, but he says like the Macedonian part always comes first. Like Bulgarian is like almost an afterthought even. But he said that his parents kind of raised him with the ideal that you respect anybody that uses the name Macedonian. If they're from Macedonia and then they use that as their identity, like there just has to be a certain level of respect there. So I kind of
yeah,
I like that framework that I can still work with you. I can still you know work get along talk about Macedonia, talk about the future, and see the best way forward. Because we still have a common homeland and an identity that's sacred to us. So I'm not as concerned. Like I said, I'm not paranoid, xenophobic like some neighbors that not everybody is on the same exact bandwagon as we are. But again,
well, I mean,
that's what Vilmot
that's
I
a
think
guy you can
understood.
have a conversation with, though. Someone who's reasonable,
Yeah,
and there's mutual respect there between his idea of what it means to be a Macedonian and like
yeah.
yours. And so, I
And I
mean, I
think
guess
that's what.
that ties into our earlier, like, how do I see a compromise? Like, there has to be mutual respect
Oh
between
yeah,
Macedonians and
absolutely.
Bulgarians and Macedonians and Greeks even.
Oh yeah, I
So
agree completely. And I think um that again that when we look at the original Vimoto, I mean, I think that was the ideal, right? I mean, they obviously it wasn't successful in the fact that they really only could only attract Vlachs that were part of the extricate church, still kind of very extricate heavy. But from Duncan Perry's books, I mean, he surveyed all the documents. He didn't find any inklings of overt Bulgarian chauvinism or preferential treatment towards Bulgarians versus other church members, for example. That was the ideal. Obviously, maybe it didn't go far enough to track those other members, but when you think about the way Macedonia moves forward, I mean, yeah, there definitely has to be some more. I don't say like a political identity, but some kind of supranational version of Macedonianism as well. That does
yeah,
unify.
well,
I think
even I
Macedonia.
think one of Perry's arguments was that probably one of the reasons that the organization ultimately failed was like a lack of Bulgarian consciousness,
Oh
especially
yeah,
after like Garvanov and the supremacists had kind of hijacked it. And that I think contributed a lot to like this idea that Vomero was really just working in the interests of Bulgaria, and probably Gavrunov actually was, and even like Boris Saratov. Um,
Yeah,
you know, um, so I don't know. It's complicated. that's
just a
that's
bit.
my famous historian's non-answer. It's complicated.
It's complicated. What's interesting, that's Chris Mitirkov, in his On the Macedonian Matters, he basically said one of the reasons Weimar was not successful was because essentially they were trying to play both sides. They
Yeah, and
wanted
they
to
couldn't shake
convince
that association. Like,
they couldn't shake
and
it. They wanted to convince Bulgarians that they were worth the investment, that they were, loyal to the Bulgarian nation, acting as, Macedonian Bulgarians, of course. But at the same time, they wanted to tell the world that, hey, we're not in bed with Sofia. We're seeking autonomy. We're not after a Bulgarian Macedonia. We're after a Macedonia for the Macedonians. So they were kind of straddling the fence to try to get, both sides aligned without actually having
yeah,
loyalty to one
and
versus the
Mashirikov
other.
himself too, like, had a very fluid identity. Like, he struggled between wanting to be a Macedonian and being a Bulgarian his entire life.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if nothing else, like, there's your proof of how fluid identity can be.
Oh,
And it
yeah,
and it can
absolutely.
change for. I mean, it's ultimately up to you. And I think with a lot of these arguments that people make, that like, oh, there was no Macedonian state, so there couldn't be a Macedonian identity. It's like this idea that identity has to be imposed from the top down. Like,
Yeah.
can it not? Can people like every day not have a say in what their identity is? Like,
Yeah. I think you think about the Macedonian people today. I mean, Um, think about like just how identity changes. I mean, they went from very, very Yugoslav oriented Macedonians of a very Slavic background. I mean, my mom or my dad, that's what they're taught in school. Like the primary Slavic migrations is the start. Then the 90s, 2000s ratchets up. But they're more of the ancient period now. Now we're decreasing, we're minimalizing the Slavic component. We're back to more of the ancient component. Then that was seen as kind of like the Gruevski era brainwashing, which agree disagree, but I think it went too far in some regards. Now people are kind of
yeah, I would agree.
moderating.
Like, like trying
It
to
changed so
establish a
much.
continuous Macedonian identity from like Alexander's lifetime to today, like it doesn't fit in the historical record,
Yeah.
and like, for me anyway, the way I see it, like the conversation on like what the ancient Macedonians and the Greeks were like is a separate conversation to like modern Macedonians and
I agree.
Greeks today. Like, and
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that there's no connections whatsoever between ancient and modern Macedonians. Like, clearly,
Oh, yeah.
like in that Christen uprising document, like they're invoking the image of Alexander, and like what that says to me is like probably the ancient Macedonians and Alexander have been part of like the folklore and mythology of the region for like everybody, not just the
Oh, yeah.
Greeks, not just Slavs, but I mean even the Albanians like have
Yeah.
like Pyrrhus and Alexander in their national mythology, right? And so I
Absolutely.
mean in that sense, like the ancient Macedonians and Alexander like are no longer historical figures. They've transcended, like they've become legends.
They become
And so
legends.
everybody's tapping into that because they're trying to form connections to the territory that they live on. And like this is no different than what the Greeks did. It's no different than what the Bulgarians did when they were forming their national identities. So the Macedonians are just doing the same thing. And so to me, that's where that connection comes from.
I agree
At least,
completely.
I
I
mean,
think
that's how I interpret it anyway.
yeah, that's fair. Now it gets some Macedonians. I'm looking up for a quote right here, by the way, but it does get some Macedonians up in arms about it. But my view on it is basically have the
Yeah,
early enlighteners, the fact that they did try to link up to ancient Macedonia, which again we can talk about the veracity of it and the factual basis for it. They chose to link up to ancient Macedonia to show that they have legitimacy and authenticity as a people, but also to kind of separate themselves a little from their neighbors. Because
yeah, absolutely.
you
And
look at
like
the
I said, I mean,
Miladinovs.
they're doing the same like romantic nationalism stuff that everybody was doing at that time. Like it's
Oh,
literally no different.
absolutely, absolutely, and the Miladinov brothers. I mean, Pulevsky. I mean, Karev. All of them. That was like their source of inspiration. So people were saying, "Oh, you only know this because of Gruevsky. You only know this because of Gruevsky." I mean, agree to
Yeah,
disagree.
I
I
mean
mean,
it goes before Gruevsky. And that's not to
Yeah.
say that like Gruevski's propaganda was like weird, like because there, what was that like that broadcast of like the Macedonoids being the progenitors of the white
Yes, the three
race, and
races: the
that's
Macedonoids,
something that
the
like everyone likes
Mongoloids.
to use to like to smear the Macedonians. But I mean, like, does that kind of propaganda not exist in Greece? Like, does it not
Oh, of
exist in
course,
Bulgaria? Like, of course,
dude.
that kind of stuff get. I mean, there's fringes on every society, right? Like,
Yeah.
just because the Macedonians have weird fringe beliefs doesn't mean that their existence as a nation is just bonk.
Oh, dude. I mean, I had a great girlfriend, and I mean, she kind of told me like a lot of people in Greece, like growing up through the church, because like Greek is seen such as a holy language, they kind of start viewing Christ as a Greek type figure. Because like
Yeah,
the last name, like they just like don't think that this is a Middle Eastern Jew. They kind of start viewing him as through the lens of like Greek, because Greek is elevated to such like a high holy place, especially being used in the Bible. They kind of start viewing him as Greek essentially. So, and there's theories out there that there's Greek settlements, colonizations in Palestine at the time, but
oh, I've
it's
had
true.
Greeks on the internet like unironically tell me that like Scottish people are Greeks, and like the Greeks were like the original ones to like settle there and whatnot. Like,
Yeah.
so I mean, like they've got weird beliefs too that aren't,
Oh yeah.
there's no historical basis for it. Like, it's not just like the Macedonians exist in this vacuum, and that they're
Oh, yeah.
just like illegitimate and unscientific and whatever.
For sure. Really quick, I did find my quote here. This is something really interesting. Um, I brought this in one of my videos, but this is it's been cited before. It says one of the more specific testimonies of Macedonian collective memory is the memories of Isaiah Majovsky. Isaiah, I guess in English, who wrote them in. He wrote about both ancient songs about the Macedonian Tsar Karan and the Empress Thessaloniki, and listened to them as he wrote 60 years ago. Um, and Grandpa Ivan Karasanovsky, a 70-year-old rich man with sheep and horses, an old man from my native village of Lazar. So he said he kind of listened to these songs being spoken essentially, and he wrote them down. And he says in 1867, with his uncles Haji Sekovi in Sokalia, which is in Jevardar area, a Jew arrived and heard their songs. He was astounded and inquired how they were kept, to which Majovsky's uncle said, "These songs are from ancient times and were passed down from father to son. They were the songs of our dads and grandfathers, and we have learned from them and we sing them." This was 1867, singing songs
Huh.
about Thessaloniki and Karan. So clearly there was some memory there. So I don't know, again, direct
Yeah.
versus indirect. Clearly, even some of the local people, as Grigorovich noted, that's all they were like singing songs about, naming their kids after. So to say this was a modern ideal of pseudo nationalism is just strikingly alarmist that people actually
Yeah.
believe that.
And I also think it's interesting that like a lot of historians like they don't look at this kind of stuff. Like they even like a lot of books on the Macedonian question, like they start in like the 1870s with the foundation of the
Mhm.
Bulgarian Exarchate. They don't look into like Victor Friedman, I think, is one of the only people, and he's a linguist that looks into like this conflict between standardizing a Slavic language around Macedonian dialects and Bulgarian dialects.
Mhm.
But yeah, you don't see a lot of mention of these documents where they explicitly say things like where they're invoking the image of Alexander or the ancient Macedonians, or they say like, let's let the Macedonian phalanx march again or whatever. I
Oh
mean,
yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
mean, these documents exist and they just kind of get ignored. Um,
They do get ignored, and I think the biggest problem, again, I think it's just the Western linear narrative what an identity is. I think that's the biggest problem, is because it doesn't fit the narrative of how the Macedonian nation developed. That it was
yeah,
again on a linear basis, not fluid, not taking different turns, and still kind of adhering to Macedonianism, but still kind of having different turns along the way. I think that's kind of
yeah,
the biggest problem. And I think one of the authors that I think had a really interesting interpretation. I mean, he even kind of said that I forget the book. It's in one of my videos. I think it was one of the most brave research theses I've actually come across in terms of kind of trying to get to the truth of the matter. He said there was basically like two types of Bulgarian identities back then. the kind of pre-national Bulgarian one that was like in the 1840s, really sponsored by Russia, just to get people de-Hellenized, but also work unified against the Patriarchate, and kind of just unified a swath of Slavic speakers against the common enemy, which was again Hellenistic Patriarchate forces, but also the Ottomans. And then there was the actual national one that was, being developed in Bulgaria, that was, proliferated in schools, educational system. And he's saying like the Macedonians very much had this like pre-national version that was kind of lingering from like the 1840s and 50s, whereas Bulgaria had a more developed one, and they just kind of clashed. They tried
Yeah,
compromise, they tried, every which way to make it work, but there were just two conceptualizations of using the same name event essentially, but um, they developed under completely different circumstances, and it was just not something that you could reconcile essentially. I think that was
yeah,
a very well put together idea of how to actually start explaining what was happening back then, instead of just putting one label on it and saying, okay, it means the same thing in Ohrid as it does in Varna. It
yeah.
just
Well, and
it's
that's
sloppy research.
that conflict with Hellenism too is really important in explaining why many Macedonians would have flocked to the Exarchate, because like even if you uh, if you go get like have mass delivered in Bulgarian, that's still more understandable than Greek, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
so being able to have gospel preached to you in a language you can understand is really important. And so a lot of Macedonians would have flocked to the Exarchate, because simply because they didn't want to be part of the Patriarchate. Um,
Hmm.
so that conflict with Hellenism is really important too, and I think and it's a big aspect of like this Macedonian question overall. Is
I
like for a
agree.
lot of people, just not being Greek was the most important thing, and so they were
Hmm.
willing to compromise on, like, well, I guess we can become Bulgarians. That's better than being
Hmm.
Greek for us.
Yeah,
So
and I do think this is kind of my deterministic view. I do think if everything gone well for like the Bulgarian side and like that was unified, I do kind of think there would have been kind of a Czechoslovakia national divorce between Macedonia and Bulgaria eventually. Again, maybe I don't have any evidence to back it, but I do think if Macedonia was incorporated into Bulgaria, that's still not have been enough for the Macedonian, again, regionalism, local patriotism, home rule kind of ideals. I still think, which was what really happened in World War II, but um, I still kind of see it as kind of it would have been the problem child of the Bulgarian kingdom, essentially, just because again their starting places were completely at different places, and
yeah, that
we
is
talk
that is
about.
interesting to think about. And like I mean, I've had people say like, oh, if San Stefano, Bulgaria had been a reality, there would be no Macedonian nation. But it's like we can't know that.
Can't know that.
Maybe one would have developed anyway. Maybe they still would have resisted assimilation. I mean, definitely Bulgaria would have had an easier time of it, if San Stefano, Bulgaria had been a reality. But that is interesting to think about too. And when we look at the occupations in both world
Mhm.
wars, they essentially had that power to assimilate, and it still didn't work.
Yeah,
So
I agree, and I think again, the reason Bulgaria was much more prevalent was because again, Bulgaria was much more hands off, autonomy, kind of do your own thing. Essentially, yeah, there were clashes, but that's what they were used to. Then when they saw that
yeah,
wasn't the case anymore, they took off the mask and started resisting. I mean, it's as simple as that. Every other movement, Greek and Serbian time period, is much more direct and abrasive against stamping out Macedonianism. Bulgarian was more subtle. Like we'll go through the schools, through the churches, through their funding. You'll come to us eventually. Yeah, there were still instances of more again direct, brutal tactics, but for the most part, it was more hands off, which is what Macedonians I think respected the most out of that. But as soon as that
yeah.
changed,
Well, and like
their
there
agenda
is
changed.
something to be said. Like there is a lot of common culture between Macedonians and Bulgarians, and
For
that's
sure.
okay. That doesn't mean that there can't be distinct identities. Like I'm sure Serbs and Croats share a lot of culture and history too. But at the end of the day, they're still different people.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think both the Greeks and the Ottomans being the common enemy, that's really what kind of bonded the two
yeah,
people. And I think about that. And you think about like the modern identity kind of being a medievalist conception for the most part, like having origin in the medieval era, especially in the Balkans. I mean, during the time period, the Greeks were still considered the Romans, Romoi.
Yeah.
And what was the only medieval counterbalance to the Romaioi were the Vulgaroi, the Slavic Vulgaroi. So I think like
Yeah.
when you think about the natural gut reaction or the knee-jerk reaction to where you go, it's I'm going to go to the medieval empire that was Slavic as that fought against the Greek Empire, the Romans. So when you think of it as like, oh, well, the Greeks weren't really the Greeks, and they were still just calling themselves the Romans. Then you look at you're like, okay, well, the Vulgaroi is also the Vulgaroi, the Bulgarians from the medieval conception,
Yeah.
in a way. We think
Right.
about the
And
two
even
kind
just
of
like
battles there.
empires in general, right? Like they comprise a lot of different peoples in one state. So like not
Hmm.
everyone in the Bulgarian Empire would have been a Bulgar. There's probably
Yeah,
Greeks and Slavs and Albanians living in that empire. I mean, the Bulgarian Empire was fairly large. There's a lot of different people that would have lived in that, and they aren't all just Bulgarians because they lived in a Bulgarian
exactly.
state. And that is
Exactly.
an interesting question there of like, was there still a distinction between being a Slav and being a Bulgar even after the Bulgars had assimilated? You know,
There's a lot of
and I
research I'm
and I
seeing
think
that
like
still says I see it all. I see some like primary sources that still refer to Bulgarian and Slavic
yeah,
in like 11th century even, which I still want to look more into it before kind of saying that. But there still was some level of distinction. It looks like between Bulgarsky, Slaviansky, or something. It
yeah,
wasn't an
and so I
overnight
mean
process.
that's an interesting question to look into too. And like I'm not a medievalist, so like I don't know a
Mhm.
lot about that. Like, but I mean I think you could even ask that question of like the ancient Macedonians and the Greeks too, right? Like just because they share culture doesn't mean they shared an identity.
Oh, yeah.
And I for me, like I don't think there will ever be like a definitive answer on if the ancient Macedonians are Greeks or not. Like I think there's a,
Yeah.
a case to be made for both sides of that argument. But
Yeah.
one thing that is like among people like even like Gene Borza, they don't dispute that like Macedonians became Hellenistic, like their culture became more Greek after Alexander's lifetime. And so
Yeah.
it's like, sure, like it could be a similar case to like Bulgars and Slavs, right? Bulgars conquered the Slavs and then they assimilated to Slavic culture but kept the
Yeah.
name. So, Macedonians conquered the Greeks, but then, you know, gradually adopted more Greek culture and like the
Yeah.
Koine Greek language. Like, can that
I
not be
agree.
the same dynamic?
That's what I thought of. I'm like, even if it's definitively proven the Macedonians were of Hellenic stock, I'd still make the claim that we have every right to celebrate that more than, I'm sorry to say, a refugee that happened to be part of the Greek church coming from Asia Minor. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, when you look at the view holistically, I think the people that are living in Edessa, in Pela, and Kastoria, Vod, and Kostur, that are natives to the land still have more reasonable basis to connect to the ancient heritage than newcomers coming from, again, a distant land that in a lot of cases didn't even speak Greek. So if the connecting
yeah,
tissue is, oh,
that's
you
an
speak Greek
important
like
thing
them,
to note too. Is like oh crap, what was the treaty that
Lucan,
started the population exchange between
Treaty
Greece and
Lucan.
Turkey? Yeah, I think that was it. But anyway, a lot of the like quote unquote like Greeks that were assimilated or that were forcibly moved back into Greece, and settled in mostly in Aegean Macedonia. A lot of them didn't speak Greek, and it's hard to say what their identity would have been. But I mean, the religion
Roman.
was still the identifying marker that those people were moved on. Muslims
Exactly.
Muslims went to Turkey and Christians went to Greece, and so
Yeah.
they had to
Lausian.
they had to adopt a Greek identity basically.
Exactly. These are the ones the kids were saying we're not Hellenes, we're Romans. So again, that's a question. I actually had a Greek guy message me one of my videos. He said, "Do you honestly believe the Macedonians were Slav? The ancient Macedonians were Slavs?" I said, "No," but I still think, like, again, that we do have a right to celebrate that. And he says, "Well, how can that be? They probably spoke Greek. They were closer to our culture than yours." And I said, "Okay, fair, but again." The original people themselves can take on different names, different languages, but still be the same people for the most part. Is obviously missed in that equation. But the second part being, if again your only connection to them is the fact that you both speak a Greek language today, how, most of the people in Macedonia were not speaking Greek. It was a small coastal minority, and the ones that did, again, were insignificant. The only reason it became Greek is because we imported a bunch and Hellenized them. So again,
Yeah,
what is your connecting tissue? If it's not the Greek language, what else can you point to? Because that even is not a reliable indicator. So
yeah. Well, and that,
I don't know,
like, to
man.
me, like that, like the Greek framing of that whole issue is like, well, the ancient Macedonians were Greek, and so Macedonia was always Greek, and that's like you're ignoring 2,000 years of history
Oh
and
yeah,
like
I made a timeline of that.
Massive Slavic migration into Macedonia, like not even just
And Greece.
Macedonia, but to Greece itself. I mean, Slavs
Yep.
settled as far south as the Peloponnese, and
Oh yeah.
and Greece in the Middle Ages had to re-Hellenize multiple times. And I
With
can't.
Greek speakers, not Greeks. I think it was under the Empress Irene, not actual like Hellenes, just people that happen to speak Greek. Was like good enough. Hey, let's get you in. Let's dilute the Slavs. So
Yeah,
like yeah,
and
the
so
Peloponnese.
really like that like the survival of even like Slavic languages really is a lot due to like the Bulgarian and the Serbian empires in the Middle
Yeah,
Ages. Because south of like Macedonia, people, adopted the Greek language, and they assimilated you know, to the Greek patriarchate essentially. So the Greek church
oh yeah,
is really a big reason why like the Greek language even exists still.
oh
And
yeah,
that in itself
yeah.
is also a miracle, right? Like it's like
It
against all
is.
odds and all these invasions and things that happened for thousands of years, like the Greek language still persists.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
It is. I think
so,
it's a
but like,
beautiful language.
just like even if the ancient Macedonians are Greek, like to me it doesn't matter. Like the
It
regions
doesn't.
changed a lot, and any like outside observer in like the late 19th, early 20th century, like all of the records say that the majority of the region was Slavic.
Yeah, without a
And
doubt.
so, I mean, things change.
Yeah, and
Is ultimately
again,
like the big takeaway there is like it doesn't matter what the ancient Macedonians were or were not.
yeah.
That doesn't make the Macedonian nation illegitimate somehow because the ancient Macedonians weren't Slavic.
Have you noticed how much of a parallel there is between the Israeli-Palestinian narrative and the Macedonian Greek one? When
Yeah,
like
and
the
what's
Israelis say,
funny
"Oh,
is
you're
I just read an article like yesterday from an Israeli like news website that was saying that Israel needs to pull a page out of Greece's book in
yep, I
silencing the
saw,
Macedonian national movement. And I was like, man, this is like
yep,
really harrowing to see something that like I'm researching for one be painted in a positive light because even a lot of Greek scholars, kind of view that as like a dark chapter in Greece's history.
not celebrating it."
Yeah,
But I,
and to see it like spun in such like a positive light, like, oh yeah, this is what we need to do to Palestine
yeah,
is, like cut their tongues out and whatever. Like that's horrible, right?
oh yeah,
But it's
I
if
did
one
this.
thing, like that's how we
Mhm,
can like present this information to other people and say this is why it's important because other people are looking at this model and saying
yeah,
this is how assimilation needs to happen. This is how conflicts need to be solved is they're looking at this
mhm,
model of how Greece, forcibly assimilated its Macedonians. Um,
yeah.
so
That's interesting.
because
I did
a
this
lot of
article.
times, I will sometimes be like, oh, the West doesn't give a shit about Macedonia, but it
But,
should, right? Like, and so I think this is how we contextualize it with other issues and say like, this is why Macedonia still matters.
why it matters. Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. Why should the West care? And I'm of the opinion personally. Like, listen, I love America, but I disagree vehemently with like the last 40, 50 years of American policy. So how much I can
Yeah,
call
and
myself
that's
a
completely
patriot
fair. Yeah.
hurts. But I really do think if the name was, Republic of Rumelia, the same boilerplate template would have been released by the State Department. Be brave, be courageous, seize the window of opportunity, look to the future, not the past, implement the name change. It could have been any name. They don't care as long as it's not aligned to Russia. It's just simple as that. And I really
Yeah.
wish it wasn't
Well,
the case. I really
that's
do
kind
think,
of the way like the U.S. State Department always views any Balkan problems. Like, oh, what's Russia doing? And it's
yep,
like these problems don't exist in a vacuum of like U.S. and Russian antagonism. Like this can
yep,
happen. Like these issues exist for people, like normal people who probably have no affinity to Russia whatsoever. And like
oh
the
yeah,
idea that like Macedonia should be able to choose its own name is not a Russian implant on Macedonians. Like this is something that's deeply felt everywhere, and it's something that the U.S. has failed to recognize.
You know what I say to the U.S. State Department? We're asking for fraternal help, not
Yeah,
overlords. We know who we
yeah,
are, the Macedonian peasants. It's a game of life or death for us. That's what I tell the
absolutely.
State Department. Ah, jeez.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're the so things we can kind of come away with, just how the West and just media people get wrong about Macedonia. Again, the idea that nationality identity is a linear Western concept. I'm sorry, it's a bunch of horseshit.
yeah. No, I
The idea that
agree.
this started in even the late the 1900s, obviously out the window. And again, the idea that when you think about Macedonia as the exception to every other national identity, national movement, that what happened with us just completely removed from every other nation in the world of how they came up with their identity, came up with their nationalism. I think is also the biggest problem in the room. I mean, think again. We've talked about this. If you put the same rings and hoops that Macedonia has to jump through to prove who they are, buddy, no nation survives. Like I
Yeah,
make fun of the
absolutely.
French. Hey, Frenchies, you got a Germanic name. You're speaking a Latin language, but your ancestry is Gaulish, Celtic. Like who the hell are you? Sounds like a made up hodgepodge. So like
Right.
when we give the same shit points that the Greeks and Bulgarians give us, no nation in Europe is going to survive. It's as simple
Yeah,
as that.
and importantly, Greece and Bulgaria don't survive by the
No,
same criteria. You know.
no.
So
I love when they make fun of us, like for the LARPing as ancient people. Like Greece does that all the time with their army and stuff,
that's
and
like what their
Bulgarians have
entire tourism
parades,
industry is based around is LARPing over ancient
LARPing.
Greece.
Yeah, and then but Bulgarians do that too. They actually dress up as Bulgar, Turkic nomads and parade through the streets holding the Bulgarian flag, but with the horsetail on it. I'm like, yeah, buddy, that's
Right.
some
Well,
that's some
and like now you
4D
see them
chess you're
even
playing.
kind of leaning into like the Thracians, and it's like that culture's been dead even longer than like the Macedonian one has been. So
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's a good way to kind of maybe end things. Just nothing. I hate to say it, Macedonia is it's a miracle that it exists, which is I love how you said that. It's a miracle that all this even survived. But there's nothing aberrative or artificial or weird about the process in which it happened. Yes, we can call it a
no, it's
miracle,
the
but
same process that like Greece went through to create its national identity, or Bulgaria,
yeah,
or really any
anybody
European national identity. Like they've done nothing different than any other European nation has.
besides not having an inkling of support or
Yeah,
legitimacy
yeah.
for the
That's
movement.
the only difference really is they got a late start and they didn't have any institutions to work with. They had to do it underground, and you know, largely were at a huge disadvantage because they had like all of their neighbors literally were contesting the territory, the people, the history.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So we are unique, but not in the way most people think we're unique because again, we had, literally nothing to go off of or build anything on top of. That's how
yeah,
we were unique. But in everything else, we're kind of almost boring in the sense that, we look to the past. We started off from a medieval based identity empire, then we look to the past to create more glory, and then we, try to ride our bets on different actors trying to help us, and it didn't work out for us. It worked out for others, but it's the same same kind of
yeah,
predictable narrative for most people.
yeah. Well, hey, this
Interesting.
was a lot of fun, man. Like, thanks
Yeah,
so
this is
much
great.
for having me, and I hope we get to do this again sometime. So,
Really quick question before we wrap up. Favorite city in Macedonia? I didn't ask you.
uh, I'm gonna have to go with Skopje. Like, and I know that's
Just when I thought we were
a lot of
friends.
people hate Skopje. I know you wanted to hear Bitola, but
Nah,
I
nah.
don't know. Like I said, Skopje was my first taste of Europe, and like everyone
Okay.
there was so kind and like hospitable to me, and like
Yeah.
with no reason. Like nobody had to be nice to me. I was just some dipshit tourist, like. But no, it left a really good impression, and like
Good.
I will say, Macedonians are very good ambassadors to Macedonia, and
Appreciate
and
that,
that
man. No, I said
people should be cognizant of that.
I mean, you're an ambassador yourself. So, Nolan, again, thank you, Spoliti, for hopping on. We're gonna do the smart thing. I think we'll have much more ideas around this. So, a couple things. Just follow Nolan on social media. He is probably one of the most prolific social media posters I've met. His stuff is one of the funniest I follow. We're on Facebook now and Instagram
Yep.
Threads,
Yeah, you guys
and
can find me Threads, Facebook, Instagram, and maybe one day Twitter again.
hopefully, Divergence. And secondly, hopefully, we're gonna get more taste of your thesis as it comes along. So we'll have maybe some time to devote to that. So keep Nolan in your thoughts, guys, as he works on that monstrosity that is the Macedonian identity. Which really quickly, I love that what you told me about Duncan Perry, that he devoted his whole life to Macedonia. At the end, he's just like, screw it. I'm gonna teach the ukulele. Like I'm done with this.
Yeah.
That's the natural progression of devoting your life to Macedonia. Just be like, yep, done. I'm gonna
It's
teach a
over.
mandolin ukulele. So pray that doesn't happen to Nolan here. We need him more than he knows. But Nolan, you're a great friend. You're a great friend of Macedonia. So we wish you all the best. And you're not even a guest anymore. You're welcome to come on anytime. We'll do these chats.
Oh man, thanks so much. We'll
Absolutely,
talk
buddy.
to you later,
All right,
Mario.
well,
So
talk to you, man. Positive.